Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. This is one of my favorite podcasts of the year. Every summer we phone Elizabeth Howell and we ask her about all of the incredibly bizarre and neat things that are going on in space. Everything from space junk landing in Saskatchewan to our very own astronauts prepping to go to Mars. It's all amazing. So welcome, Elizabeth Howell, PhD. She's a writer for Spaceflight Channel, space.com. She PhD in space studies, so that's very impressive. And her latest book is Why Am I Taller with Dave Williams, another Canadian astronaut. Great to see you, Elizabeth.
Great to see you as well. And I admit it also is one of my favorite moments of the summer.
Where we get to gossip about all this stuff. I want
Exactly.
to take you back to space junk landing in Ituna, Saskatchewan, which is literally just down the road from where I am. And then SpaceX wrote a check and came up and retrieved it all. And the farmer quite nicely dedicated all of that to the local rink fund. But what the heck was it?
I had that same question when I saw the pictures. Wasn't it insanely large, this thing?
Yes.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of describe the scale if you haven't seen the pictures, but it
Yeah.
looks like it's about two people tall, right?
Yeah,
Almost, and pretty
exactly.
wide, and it's all like black and charred. And he was what, trying to clean up the field after the winter, right? And he just found this thing lying there and said,
Absolutely. And
yeah.
like it could have landed on his head, right? So,
Exactly, or his barn or his house,
right,
his equipment. And then the neighbors also had pieces, from what
right.
I understand,
I
right?
think there's a lot of it around here. I mean, it's fortunate in the sense that we're not very densely populated, but is this happening all the time? Like, is junk dropping from space regularly?
Junk does drop from space regularly, but not that big usually. And
Yeah.
that's the concern. You don't want that kind of thing in your field or your house or your head.
No,
So
no.
Really, SpaceX quite seriously said, yes, there is a problem because it has happened before. I have a colleague in North Carolina, and funny that you mentioned being so close to this space junk senator
Yeah.
because he was within a short drive of another space junk from SpaceX that fell in his state. And so he drove out there. It happened to be in a nice, I would almost call it a state park type situation. So it was very
Okay.
pleasant and wooded. And then there was this junk there, also picked up by SpaceX. And then there was another in Australia some time ago. So this is repeated, and SpaceX, being the good engineering company that they are, said, maybe we should look at this. And they have a solution. So what they said was this piece of big chart, whatever, is
Yeah.
coming from the storage area of their Crew Dragon. That is the spacecraft that takes astronauts to the International Space Station and other missions as well. And so when it comes back to Earth, they thought it would all burn up. And clearly, as your farmer friend knows, it does not. And
No.
so what they said is we need to change the way that we're doing our reentries coming back from Earth, coming back from space to Earth. So what they're going to do now is, instead of arriving in Florida, they're going to be arriving in California. And the reason they're doing that is they're going to be depositing that big charred piece into the Pacific Ocean. So in the one sense, that's good. It's not coming down in a
Yeah.
person's field, but on the other sense, it's still coming down in the ocean, which I think we can agree is not fantastic.
Well,
So
that
yeah,
remind because I was reading last night about the soon to be destruction of the International Space Station because it's been up there since 2000. I guess it's getting old, and that's the plan. SpaceX is supposed to kind of drag it down and drop it in the Pacific Ocean. Like that would be a big piece.
that would be a very big piece. In fact, someone was asking NASA, would you send a submarine mission to maybe try and pick up
Yeah.
some of the pieces, even for museums? And they're saying, huh, that might be a good idea. But, um, working in government, I'm sure you understand their funding situation. And so they were intrigued by the idea, but I'm not sure that the funds were really there in Congress to be funding a submarine.
Exactly.
So, um,
Sometimes the obvious eludes us, right? That this would
exactly.
be not only would it be good for museums and study here on Earth and all the rest of it, but you don't want other people getting a hold of some of the stuff that might be proprietorial.
Exactly. So I think they will remove some things from inside that's
Yeah,
proprietary before they send the big thing back to Earth. But it still would be interesting to
yeah,
pick the module that was in space for what, 30 years and then
yeah.
display it somewhere, even if it's a bit crushed and wet. I'm sure they can
No,
respond
I mean,
somewhat. Yeah. So
space junkies would love to go and see it. I mean, this could be a whole. So, okay, so that is an interesting question. We're just going to pause that one for a moment, which is where does this junk go? And now is this a whole new kind of environmental issue that we have to be thinking about? I want to come back to the other issue, which is these two astronauts that are stranded in space. I won't say lost in space. We know where they are. We just can't get them. This, what?
oh, we could take a whole hour talking about Butch and
I
Sunny.
know.
Those are the astronauts, but I was lucky enough to meet them in the spring before they launched. Obviously, I'm not up in
Yeah.
space despite my background. And what happened was they flew up on a Boeing. The spacecraft has been there before, but never with people on board. Then they were
Ah,
trying to meet up at the International Space Station, and very simply, their propulsion system broke. The thing that powers their engines didn't work. And NASA wanted to take some time and understand what happened and do some testing. And so they did testing in space and they did testing on the ground. And when you get your car and you bring it into the mechanic and there's a lot of troubleshooting, and then they said we don't know, we still don't
yeah.
know, it could be anywhere in the system. They're having that same problem, but it's docked in space, so it's even worse, right? So then NASA said, okay, we have experts. We're going to try and find people that work with spacecraft that are at, I don't know, Venus or Jupiter or Saturn or even outside of, Pluto's orbit. Those people are experts in finding long distance spacecraft and fixing them. Maybe we can talk to them. So they call some folks that are used to that, and they still don't have answers. So, more seriously, you were right, Senator. There's not an immediate plan to get them home, but three options very simply. The first one would be Starliner's okay. That's if all the safety protocols are followed and they think that it's still okay. So they'll put them back on the Boeing spacecraft and bring them home. Or there are two opportunities to bring them home on the same SpaceX spacecraft we were talking about. So they could do it with one that's already in space, or they can do it with one launching in space soon. And
They're sending up food and supplies in unmanned missions, right?
yes, so they already have a reserve on board. And so people who've worked in, say, Canada's North understand that you need to have
Yeah.
food and a reserve of food there at all times because you never know when the seasons are going to change quickly and you might have to pivot, right? You're planning. And so they have the same thing on the space station. And in fact, there are 4 months, if you could believe that, 4 months worth of supplies. So food, oxygen, clothing, toothbrushes, all the things you need
Yeah.
to live up there. And so they're living off of that. And then you're right, there are cargo ships launching all the other things they need.
This is not great news for Boeing. I mean, they're having trouble in our skies and now they're having trouble in space. This is not good.
No, it's been a very difficult year for them for sure. And I know that they've had some management changes, and there have been a lot of questions about that in the press conferences. And I think really the key here to try to understand what's going to happen next is to say NASA's been through similar and even worse situations in the past, right? Where their astronauts were put in great danger, and some of them, as we well know, were killed. We
Yeah.
remember Challenger, we remember Columbia, and other accidents of the past. And luckily, I wouldn't say luckily, but maybe with that history in mind, people
Yeah.
are very careful now. And there's a lot of really good conversations happening at NASA where they're saying there is a risk, but is it an acceptable risk or is it unacceptable in terms of safety? And because they don't have those answers yet, they're not doing anything, which is good, right? If
Yeah.
something's broken and you don't quite know how to fix it, if you rush it, it's going to get worse. So
Yeah.
I'm
So
glad that
just,
they're pausing and
yeah.
deciding what to do next.
That raises in my mind this question. This is what I do when you're coming on the podcast. Then I start reading all this stuff over the weeks. So the low Earth orbit economy is becoming a real growth industry, if I can put it that way. This starts out with really rich people who can have their own, forms of transportation going up into space, but obviously not going, where the space station is. And now people are starting to look at what could happen there, what kinds of activities could go on. Is this, can people stay? But then when you have that juxtaposed with these two trapped in space, that kind of raises a lot of questions.
Exactly, because we're wondering if all of these space tourists might sound like a derogatory term, and I'm not
Yeah,
meaning it that way, but there's a difference, I think, that if you train as an astronaut and you do it for 15, 20 years, like Dave Williams or Chris Hadfield or Jeremy Hansen,
right.
any of those people have a different, I think, understanding of space than someone who paid for a seat and
Yeah.
is going up for a few minutes. That said, there are those that are in between. There's a mission launching called Polaris Dawn that is funded by a billionaire who has a lot of jet pilot experience, Jared Isaacman. So some people really do understand it. But you're right. I wonder how much the ordinary person, the ordinary rich person, if that makes any sense. Anyway, whatever those people may be,
Yeah.
if we understand what the risk is and then what they're doing, they're putting their lives on the line when they sit on the rocket, as we all know.
Well, I think everybody remembers the undersea, the underwater episode where people went, and I mean that had a gruesome end to it. And we can't just do this lightly. This is not, boys with toys kind of thing. This is life and death.
It is definitely life and death. And I'm hoping that the companies that are launching, and SpaceX is a good example of this, but I'm
Yeah.
hoping that companies that launch non-professional astronauts do have an understanding. On the more successful side, maybe we don't talk about this enough in my industry, but we have short-term professional astronauts that go to the space station, for example, and they might go only for a week or two, but they go through a company called Axiom Space, and it's based in Houston. And what they do is they have a literal retired NASA astronaut sitting in the crew. So you would imagine they know what they're doing, on many
Yeah.
levels. And then what they do is they train their crews for months and months and months. And we actually had a Canadian flying on board one of those with assistance from the ground with astronaut Dave Williams not too long ago. So there is a nice balance, I think, that is achieved by those missions because you do have rich people launching, but they also have a considerable amount of training before
Yeah.
they go.
And I don't want to disparage them because of their money, we are learning.
We
Uh,
are.
yeah. So and government can't and tax dollars can't pay for all of this. So I think I don't mean to disparage them either by saying rich people because this is we're all benefiting. What are we doing in the low orbit economy that we can't do here, or are we just doing it in a different place?
Well, the low orbit economy is about developing medical treatments, for example. That's a large reason that we send people up there
Yeah.
because when you go into space for a few weeks or months, your body artificially ages. It gets weaker, your bones and your muscles and your eyes and all that begin to change in ways that are very similar to when you become, if I may say, an elder, somebody who
Yes.
is reaching the latter part of their lives. And then if we find good ways to help those folks in orbit, then maybe we can pivot the same treatments for folks here on Earth, right? And
Yeah.
so that's one part of the economy. Another thing they do is up on the space station, they actually make stuff. And so if you can imagine a little maker space, a lab in a box, they actually have quite a few of those and they can make really cool materials because this is pure no gravity. So
Right.
things are a little bit more mixed evenly than you can do it in some places on Earth. And that can make stronger materials or better drugs, as I said. So these are
Hmm.
other ways that we could be making money while still having people in the process.
Right. And learning other things. Okay.
Exactly.
So let's come back down to Earth so that we can look at what's going on up there. So moon is the focus now, and the moon is kind of a stepping stone to Mars, right? We're kind of going
Exactly.
to practice everything on. So just to, like the things I've been reading about the moon of late, so that we've found a cave, like tubes, a sea of tranquility. We've found water, enough to fill the oceans on Earth, which is just kind of breathtaking when you think about that. So is this all new? Like we didn't even have an inkling of this because of course water on any of these, the moon, Mars, whatever, means life is a possibility.
We didn't used to think there was any water at all. When
Yeah.
Neil Armstrong and all those people were landing on the moon, we thought it was a barren, dry desert spot. And then back in the late 1990s, a few NASA and other spacecraft, Japan as well, found some moon evidence. India as well. There were several spacecraft sort of in a row that did this. In
Hmm.
any case, we did know there was water, but we don't know how much still. And we're getting different answers from different spacecraft. But
Okay.
if there is enough to be living off of, that would be amazing because we could use the water for drinking, for hygiene, we can use it for machinery. And then on Mars, we also used to think it was dusty and dry, but there's some kind of water reserve. There's glaciers, so we could perhaps, I'm ignoring the environmental implications, but we
Right,
could
right,
the
right.
glaciers, right? That'd be one way. Or we could somehow incredibly tap underground into these underground reserves and bring them up. But these solutions are a little expensive. And so I would be curious to find out if there's a business case for these. And then I'm sure there's folks working on that as we speak, right? Just quietly in the darkness somewhere. I'm sure that SpaceX might have some folks on it, for example.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so why the new focus on the moon again? I mean, I'm thinking back to the 60s as a young kid seeing, folks walk on the moon and plant a flag, and then of course we have the countless conspiracy theories that it never happened. I'm assuming you're a believer.
I'm a believer. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We were there, and why? Like there's always the politics of there, like let's get there first before the Russians or before the Chinese, but basically why are we doing this?
Well, I'm sure there's the human need to explore that we could incite, right? And I mean, the circumstances were obviously very different, but we had a number of Europeans come into Canada with poor practices, of course, as we all know, because of the Indigenous folks that were there first. But they had this need, this want to go somewhere new. And they
Yeah.
wanted to go out west, as you very well know. And then, for better or for worse, here we are today with folks that came during those periods. I'm hoping we can take better practices into other worlds and I
Yeah.
understand that we don't want to be sitting there as colonizers, to use a very loaded term, because
Yeah.
there might be microbes, there might be other forms of life that are on Mars, and we have to be very sensitive of that and not just come in and say, we're going to do it this way without recognizing what might be there before. So I think that there is going to be a very complicated path forward because who can afford to go there and how can we afford to go there, why we want to go there. So there's a need of exploration. Some folks say that there might be resources we can find on the moon or on Mars that we can't find easily on Earth, or that even some people say it might solve overpopulation. But I don't think that's really a sustainable solution. There's probably other
Well,
ways.
no, it isn't. And there's lots of stuff written about kind of the other way that there are parts of the world, including our own, where we're kind of depopulating to a certain extent in terms of not having, not replicating ourselves. But so, I mean, things like precious metals, or what do you think might be there that we need that we don't have enough of?
Well, one of the arguments that has been put forward, especially on asteroids, little space rocks, is that say that you wanted to go all science fiction and
Yeah,
make some kind of a big settlement out there on the moon near an asteroid, even trying to make some kind of a transportation network between Earth, Moon, and Mars. It'd be a lot handier to use the materials that you have sitting right there than to
yeah,
be hauling it back and forth from Earth. And then there's a spectrum of people saying, well, some folks say that wouldn't be affordable in any case. And there's others that say, well, it might be the better solution. So it's hard to say where that will fly until we have maybe some more businesses in the discussion. And then I think probably the key will be a little bit of seed funding from government because traditionally in space, that's how programs move forward. So let's look at SpaceX. We talk
yeah,
about it all the time. The way that it got started in large part was due to big contracts from NASA and the Department of Defense in the United States. And then they were able to take that money and pivot it into other businesses like Starship, for example, right? That big
yeah.
spacecraft that's going to launch humans to the moon one day. So there might be a need on the moon and eventually on Mars for NASA and the Department of Defense to keep putting more and more money in because they want to stay current with what businesses need and to be providing more avenues. And they're already doing that to some measure, but they might do it more and more as the economy grows.
Or the Elon Musks and SpaceX might just keep doing it themselves because dealing with government is often complicated.
Exactly. And then there's questions about the jurisdiction, right? Once you
Right.
start to move out beyond Earth or even on Earth, who is responsible for what? I'm sure that you might remember that incident where a Soviet back then satellite crashed into Canada's north back in the late
Right.
70s. And then there was discussions about who's responsible for paying for the cleanup because there was a nuclear satellite, right? And there was radiation and terrible stuff all over the north. And then that's a jurisdictional issue. It's Soviet, but it landed in Canada. You know,
Yeah.
who's responsible, who does the cleanup, who does the paying. And it gets even more complicated when you go to the moon because there's no big jurisdiction out there. Same
Right.
on
We're
Mars.
fighting about it enough here. I mean, Canada claims sovereignty in the north, but others challenge that on a pretty regular basis.
Exactly. So imagine
Yeah.
that ported out to the moon. And then
Yeah.
you see that that's why some defense interests are involved, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard to enforce.
So, what is it that, why do we have to go? These are baby talk questions here. Why do we have to go and learn what to take that next step to Mars? Why is it kind of a forerunner to
Oh,
real
okay.
activity on Mars?
The moon is closer, and I realize it's far, so space is a big place. But
Yes.
let's put it this way. To go to the moon with the technology we have today takes roughly 3 days, depending on how you do it. But the way the Apollo astronauts do it, let's do that. The way the
Yeah.
Apollo astronauts went to the moon, it took 3 days. The way the Apollo astronauts and even today's astronauts go to Mars, it would take 9 months or more. So
Ah,
if something goes wrong at the moon, like what happened famously with Apollo 13, you can bring them back home in a few
yeah.
days. If something goes wrong at Mars, like the movie The Martian, then
Yes.
it could be months or years. And that's why we want a lot of practice.
So we're involved in that. I mean, this is what Jeremy Hansen's life is about, is getting to Mars.
Exactly, getting to the moon and getting to Mars. And he generously does speak with us from time to time about the training that he's doing for the Artemis 2 mission. And
Yeah.
what he's been saying lately is we all need to understand it's not a mission with a firm timeline. It's not like President Kennedy in the 60s, where they
Right.
said, we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, and that's it, right? There's a new understanding now about how technology works and how safety works. And you can't attach safety and technology to a timeline. That's just not the way it works.
Yeah.
Instead, what you have to say is we're going to be moving at a safe pace. And if something needs to change, such as with Starliner, then you're going to wait and you're going to investigate, and then you're going to do it at the pace that requires. So, practically speaking, he was supposed to go to the moon. It was just about this year, December 2024. But
Right.
they found some issues with the spacecraft and they said, you know what? Let's pause. Let's do some more looking. Let's do some more thinking. And the current thinking as we're filming this is now September 25. So it might be another year or so before he goes. And that would be exciting whenever it is, whether it's in 25 or 26. I'm going.
Yeah.
Are you going?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
The frustration, I mean, that
yeah,
human nature and the political incentives, as we've talked about. I mean, you want to do it if you're, Jeremy Hansen, this is what you've waited your whole life for, and so you want to get there. And then that has to, as you say, always be tempered by, are we ready? Are we really ready? Because we're not going to risk this again, one more big, crisis, and people are going to start to say, why are we doing this? Um,
exactly. Yeah. And just briefly, Jeremy is a fighter pilot by nature, and the people
mhm,
that are on Starliner are test pilots. So they're
right,
used to aircraft doing funny things because
right.
they're flying high performance stuff. And so they're used to pausing and saying, okay, I don't understand quite what's going on. Let's stop and wait. Let's stop and
Yeah.
take a look at this and figure it out.
I want to just get your view because you've got an inside take on this. You wrote the book with Dave Williams. You've spoken to Jeremy Hansen many times. Mark Garneau sat in Parliament. I've had the opportunity to speak with him. Who are these people? What makes them tick?
They're fascinating, aren't they?
Yes.
um,
Yes.
I actually find what makes them tick is really focusing on the training and helping their team. It's almost like speaking to someone on a remote expedition in Canada or in Antarctica, because
Yep.
they need to be so aware of their environment to a degree that, well, me, the urbanized Canadian, I'm sitting in Ottawa as we film this, doesn't need to, right? I know the electricity is going to work most of the time, right?
Hmm.
They don't fundamentally, right? And you would live your life very differently if you don't know if the electricity will work at a given moment. And then the
Yes,
way
I
to
just
survive in
had
those.
28 hours without it here on
Exactly,
Earth,
right?
and you
So you
don't
live in a
even
different
realize.
reality.
Yes,
Exactly.
it was a good little lesson to have. Usually
It,
happens over the summer and you lose it for 5 or 6 hours, but more than a day, you start to really think about food and sleep and all of those things. Yeah.
exactly. And then as good Canadians, we try and rely on our neighbors at these times, right? I'm
Right.
sure they've got a lot of networks locally to help you
You
out.
bet.
And even here in our urbanized environment, my husband likes to roam the street because it is good to know your neighbors. And so
Yes.
constantly with the dog, outside and networking with the other dog owners, and it's all great, right? But more seriously, in space, that's a big difference. If you know your crewmates, can connect with your crewmates, and if you can work together to solve issues. And that's what they're focused on all the time. A lot of their training is just putting them into weird situations. They're going to be dropped in the wilderness for a week. Okay, here you go. Find your way home. And then they learn as a team how to work together and what to do if they're tired or frustrated or can't find their way or someone gets hurt. And then they can take that experience and bring it up to space.
And then they're learning about one another. I mean, you have to assume that once they've gotten to this level, they've been through enough tests and psychological testing that, there are no big surprises, but you do have
Exactly.
to know how the other person is going to react in a crisis, right?
Exactly. So for a typical space station mission, we only talk about the time they're in space, unfortunately, right? And the lead up
Yeah.
just before. They're in training for 2 or 2.5 years at the least. And that's
Yeah.
just for that mission. Even before the mission, talk to Jeremy Hansen. He joined the Canadian Space Agency in 2009. 2009.
Yeah.
Now, he
It's
waited an unusually long time for various reasons, but still, he's been in training for this Artemis 2 mission, if you think about that, for what, 15 years? Almost
yeah.
20? Yeah,
Yeah.
long time. Yeah.
So that's the thing. That's what I mean about the frustration factor, because having put in all that time and then the delays, all legitimate and for safety reasons and all of that, you also have to deal with the fact that it might not be you. It
My
might
God.
be somebody else that benefits from everything that you have done, and you might not make that mission. I mean, that's that's such an amazing issue to try and deal with.
Exactly. And it does happen from time to time. You still see astronauts being deassigned very, very late in the mission. A recent example is Jeanette Epps. So she's a NASA astronaut, and they never explained all the dynamics publicly about why she was withdrawn from a space station mission, but she waited an extra 6 years or so to launch on a spacecraft. And she's there right now as we're filming. So it worked out.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that it was a difficult pathway and probably a few sort of questions about what do I do next. But it's true. I
Mm.
think it's actually true of many of us in life, right? Because we can all think of disappointments we've had where the other person got the thing that we wanted,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then you have to sort of sit back and ask yourself, well, from a team perspective, how beneficial was that? And usually there's a reason, that one can point to.
Yeah.
Um, and if there isn't, then I guess you need to do something else. That would
Yeah.
be
No, no, exactly. And that
exactly.
might come just from the frustration factor along. And also other things happen like NASA and everybody's lobbying for their piece of government funding. But I was reading about this Viper project that was just canceled by NASA, right? I mean, they have to make decisions all the time that impact everything else too, and decide how they're going to cut up the cash as it
Well,
were.
that's
But
the thing, right? Because government has limited resources and you're trying to spend your dollars responsibly. I always appreciate that.
yep,
And there was a lot of questioning about that particular decision, though, I admit, because folks were saying this is an almost ready rover. It was going to look for water on the moon, but it just illustrates the larger problem, which is that NASA only has so much money to give. And they felt that something else had to have more priority than this moon rover. Now, it may be resurrected. They're actually looking at hoping that another company will take it over. and then
Like
send
a
it up
private company
like
would.
a private company, exactly. And then they might modify it somewhat, but maybe they could resend it later in the future. But it was a disappointment. And you're right, because at the end of the day, there are jobs affected, people affected.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know if you were following, but when one of the Mars rovers finally finished its mission after almost 20 years, it was only supposed to last 90 days. It lasted almost 20 years. Um, People had built their whole lives on this.
Yeah,
Children had grown up from babies into college age, as they would say in the United States, right?
right.
You get very attached over these years, and that's not even counting all the development time. If you count
Right.
the development time, the 20-year mission might become a 40-year mission or a 50-year mission. I mean, look at Voyager, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Interesting, because those are, and again, you're never sure, as you say, about whether that was the right call. I mean, if it's so close, maybe, and if it's going to the moon, which is sort of the next real focal point now, um, why they would do it anyway. I mean, there are often no answers for all of this stuff. So,
No, there are no easy answers, and it's usually a complex
yeah,
answer, even when you get it, right? Because there are all these inputs, and they just have to say, okay, what's the best decision given all of that? And weighing multiple stakeholders, I can only imagine how difficult that is, even as an insider, from an outside perspective, I
right,
can't.
right.
Yeah.
All right. So, what do you think about who's winning the space race? A lot of people are saying, look, China is quietly really putting a whole lot of money into this. They don't make the same fuss and muss that the Americans always do, which is, we're doing this and it's live television, it's this and that. Um, China works away at this more quietly. Do we really have any idea where they are in this whole race?
It's difficult to say because, as you said, they don't tell us very much. Usually
Right.
we just see the results. It's almost like what we had 60 years ago with the Soviet Union. It's not quite that secret, but you remember back then it would be like, surprise, there's an astronaut launch today, or a cosmonaut, as they would call it, right? It's
Yeah.
not quite the way in China. They give you a little bit more notice, but they're moving very dynamically and they're moving very quickly, and they're doing a lot of valuable science on their own. They have a whole space station up there, and they're actually running projects. And
Right.
one of the questions right now is when the International Space Station finishes, as we talked about earlier, are there going to be American space stations, commercial stations, private stations ready to take that business over? Because
Right.
if not, what they've been saying in Congress is maybe those companies, if they don't have restrictions, would move over to China and start to use their space station instead because there's no other alternative. And so you're right, without the foresight perhaps to know what China's priorities are in a decade or 20
Yeah.
years, how do you make those decisions as an American or a Canadian or anybody else in the business to be determining where to go next when you have other alternatives out there?
Do the politics here on Earth, meaning, we're going to put restrictions on China, we're battling about, all sorts of things down here. Is it different when you pick up the phone and say, look, we've got a couple of guys stranded up in space. Could we borrow your turf? I mean, are the rules different?
I think that they have a different understanding in some senses because look at the International Space Station. One of the major partners on it is Russia. Now, we
Yeah.
all know what happened with Russia a couple of years ago, and that's continuing in
Yeah.
Ukraine, their actions. Russia lost most of its space business. But for policy reasons, the Americans and the other consortium members, including Canada, said, let's go ahead with the missions on the International Space Station. To everybody's credit, they've launched and they've landed many, many crews since what that was, 2022, so 2 years
Hmm.
ago. No issues. I mean, technical issues to be sure from time to time, but from a policy side, it's not like anybody was stuck up there because they were refused a ride home.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good thing that we're seeing at least some discussions, and it's good to keep channels open even in difficult times, I would imagine.
Where are we? I mean, I sometimes get a little embarrassed when we keep talking, or certainly we see political leaders doing it. We keep talking about the Canadarm and our contribution to space. We've contributed really good people. But what have we done? Like, where are we in terms of contributions, things like the Canadarm in modern times? I was listening to a discussion recently about Canada not having enough launch capability, probably for a lot of this, low Earth orbit activity that goes on. And in Nova Scotia, I know they're doing um, prepping to do it there. What are we contributing?
We're contributing robotics expertise, medicine expertise. We have literal doctors. Dr. Dave Williams, you mentioned earlier,
Yep.
has flown in space. We have had food. We actually had a whole big food challenge where we said to Canadian companies, hey, if we're trying to be making food for space, can we also
Yep.
pivot it for Indigenous or rural communities here in Canada? And they were able to come up with many great solutions. There's all sorts of things you can eat and not have to grow a lot of things to make that work. And then, yes, as you're pointing out, we're finally starting to build out more launch capability. The problem is you can't just launch a rocket overnight for good,
Yeah.
responsible reasons, right? You want to make sure that the community is ready and that they have the safety protocols and that all of the lands are being used appropriately and culturally in a sensitive way. So they consulted with the fisheries, they consulted with the Indigenous people, the environmental people, and the regulations are going to be changing gradually, but there needs to be conversation to make sure that we're doing it safely. So I'm very hopeful, but it is going to take time because the Americans have had that authorization for 60 years, let's say.
Right.
The Canadians, it's been on and off. We were off for 30 years and now we're back on. It's going to take
Yeah.
a few years, I think. Yeah.
So is Nova Scotia like a particularly good place? Is it just because it's coastal? Like what is the actual benefit?
It's an amazing place. And so it's close to Halifax. They can get a lot of transportation in and out through Halifax and by sea. So if you need to build something, no problem. Lots of infrastructure available. And in terms of launching, you're right. It's right by the coast. So if they have a failure of any sort, they can just pop the rocket. It would be uncrewed into the ocean and then clean it up later. And
Yeah.
it can also launch in two directions. It can launch towards Europe. So it's called an equatorial orbit. It goes around the equator of Earth, or it can launch over the poles. And these are good missions for different reasons. If you're going over the equator, that's where most of the traffic tends to go anyway. So it's good for generic satellite missions. If you want to look at the whole Earth, put it over the poles, because if you think about it, you're going over the pole, eventually the entire Earth is going to rotate underneath you. So it's a lot
Hmm.
of really good business for them.
All right. So you can see where what I've been thinking about here and what I've been looking at. So since we last spoke, what's the most interesting thing to you that's happened in this whole situation, the whole
I think
world
that
of
we've
space?
covered a lot of it, but one
Yeah.
thing that I did want to be highlighting was some really nice progression in the diversity aspect because I was fortunate enough to get off the phone with an astronaut in the United Kingdom. The
Yeah.
European Space Agency, many folks don't know that, but the Canadian Space Agency is part of the membership. And so that does have a Canadian application. Anyway, this British astronaut, United Kingdom astronaut, his name is John McFall. He happens to be missing a part of his leg. He had a motorcycle accident at age
Hmm.
19, but he retrained himself to the extent that he competed in the Paralympics. And he also became, over time, a surgeon, a trauma specialist, an orthopedist. And he is an expert on robotic limbs because he uses them and he also studies them. And so he eventually became a backup, not quite a backup astronaut, but they call it a reserve astronaut. He's
Yeah.
not full time with the European Space Agency, but he's sort of like in the military. If you get called up from the reserve, that's
Yes.
what
Yeah.
he's sitting there waiting for that call, and then he might go and do a mission. So anyway, he did a study with the European Space Agency and with the International Space Station people saying, okay, if me or some other person were to fly to the International Space Station with an artificial leg, would there be an issue? And he sat and did a long study. And it involved, okay, can I put on a spacesuit? Can I get in and out of a spacecraft? Can I exercise? Because you need the limb attached to you to exercise.
Right.
If I'm floating and somebody has a heart attack and I don't have my limb on, can I still do CPR? And you can. And so he did months and months and months of work. They're
Wow.
still analyzing the study. But the good news, the TLDR, as the younger folks would say, is that there is no showstopper. So we can't say that he will fly to space, but we can say that his chances are darn good now because they've done all that work. And isn't that a wonderful example of what space
Yeah,
can do?
that's great.
Yeah,
I mean, that is
yeah,
and it should be kind of a learning experience for everybody anyway.
exactly.
Okay, now I have one final question for you, which is, we say these things, use these turns of phrase quite regularly in our lives, and one of them is once in a blue moon would
Yes.
such and such happen. August is blue moon month, as far as I can tell, or maybe it's just this year. What the heck is a blue moon?
The funny thing is, there's actually a debate, if you can believe that, about what a blue moon is.
I'm
So,
sure
one of
there
the
is.
definitions, I could go into a big thesis, and I don't plan to. It's not a good idea on TV to do that. Anyway, one of the definitions is if you have two full moons in a month, then the second full moon is called the blue moon. It's not to do with the color, it's just to do
Okay.
with a naming tradition of some sort. And so, anyway, if the second full moon in August is happening, that would be the blue moon. But other people have different definitions as well. So we'll leave it at that.
All right, because I've seen well, we've had a full moon here. It seems like we've had more than one. So, all right, that is terrific. I just feel so much smarter than when we start these conversations because it doesn't matter what I ask you, you have an answer and you know it. So I haven't missed anything. There's not anything that's
No,
going to happen
no, I
tomorrow,
think that you
but
covered it all. Space is a busy place, as you found out. So
is
it's good to
it
see these
ever?
updates. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Elizabeth, it's just great to talk to you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator.
Elizabeth Howell, she is, I love saying this, a PhD in space studies. That's all great. She writes for Spaceflight Channel, space.com, and you can find her book, Why Am I Taller, that she wrote with astronaut Dave Williams, which what is the answer to that? Why are you taller? What is that title about?
Your spine stretches in space because there's nothing pulling you down. That's why you
Right.
get taller. And one of the big problems you get is a backache, if you can
Yeah,
believe that. Yeah.
because it's moving. Well, if they could just make space travel make us younger, I think there'd be a whole lot more people signing up as opposed to
Oh,
making us
totally.
older.
I'd be
Don't you
there.
think? Could you work
Yeah,
on that?
I can
Okay.
work on that. Okay, next time.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. And thank you for joining us today. We'll see you again very soon for another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Bye for now.